Marcus Webb stood 7 feet tall, had dunked on everyone he'd ever faced, and in the summer of 1990, he made the last mistake of his basketball life. He laughed at Michael Jordan's face. It was late August, a Tuesday night in Chicago, the kind of night the city exhales heat slowly, like a furnace that hasn't quite decided to cool. The Dearborn Street courts on the south side were lit by 4 overhead lamps in the particular orange glow that only streetball has, that mixture of sodium vapor and human ambition. The asphalt was still warm under sneakers. The crowd, 2 and 3 bodies deep around the chain-link perimeter, pressed close enough that you could smell the summer on them. Jordan had been coming to these courts since his early Bulls years, quietly, without announcement, because this was where the game lived in its purest and most dangerous form. He wore a white cut-off shirt that night. No number, nothing to announce who he was. He didn't need to. Webb had arrived an hour earlier with 4 men from the west side, and a reputation that preceded him like weather. 7 feet, 240, a former junior college prospect who had blown out his knee before he could go anywhere formal with his talent. The injury had not reduced him. If anything, it had concentrated everything, all the frustration, all the humiliation of a career that ended before it began, into a physical presence that was genuinely frightening. He had spent 3 years becoming the most dominant player on every outdoor court in Chicago. He moved like someone who had decided that if the professional game would not have him, he would punish every man who still played it recreationally. Webb was not a cautious player. He was a verdict. The teams form the way they always form on those courts. Best players call next. You run until you lose. No argument about it. Jordan had been there quietly for 40 minutes, watching, not yet playing, sitting on the concrete barrier at the court's east end with his sneakers unlaced and a bottle of water in his hand. One of Webb's people looked over at him, said something to Webb. Webb looked, and then Webb laughed. Not a careful laugh. Not the kind a man makes when he's being polite about something funny. The kind that says, "I see you, and you are not a problem." 3 seconds later is not actually what happened, but the truth of what followed was so compressed, so inevitable, so completely without the mercy of time, that the people who were there remembered it that way. They remembered it as a single motion. They remembered it as something close to instant, because what Jordan did to Marcus Webb that night was not complicated. It was final. The real story, though, is not about the dunk. It never was. The real story is about what it means to underestimate a man who has been keeping a list. Jordan had averaged 33 points per game the previous season, leading the NBA in scoring for the 4th consecutive year. He had made the all-defensive first team. He had taken the Bulls to the conference finals and watched them lose to the Detroit Pistons again. That particular wound still fresh, still bleeding, still providing the specific fuel he needed to play the way he played. The summer of 1990 was not a restful summer for Michael Jordan. It was a training camp that happened to include these courts, these nights, these men who did not know what they were walking into when they stepped onto the same rectangle of asphalt as number 23. Webb's size was real. His dominance on these courts was real. He had, in the weeks before that Tuesday night, blocked the shots of 3 men who had played Division I college basketball. He had dunked over a former DePaul player who had 8 inches and 60 pounds on a normal human being. The legend of Marcus Webb in the summer of 1990 was not invented. It was earned, and that, precisely, was the problem. A man who has become accustomed to being the largest and most dangerous thing in the room develops a certainty about himself that can survive almost anything. Almost. Jordan laced his sneakers the way he always did. Right shoe first, double knot, no variation. A ritual he had been performing since high school in Wilmington, North Carolina, when his older brother Larry was still the better player, and Michael was still the one trying to prove something. Some habits form in the years before you understand who you are. Some habits form in the years when you are still deciding whether you will become what you are capable of being, or whether you will settle for less. Jordan never settled, not once. The double knot was a small and private ceremony, the first act of a performance that would follow. He stepped onto the court. The game had already started at the other end. He watched for 2 possessions. His expression, by accounts of men who were standing 12 feet away, was entirely blank. not focused, not intense. Blank. His teammates from those court sessions have said the same thing, independently, across decades of interviews. The blankness was the warning. The smile meant nothing. The trash talk meant nothing. The blank face meant he had already decided what was going to happen, and was simply waiting for the moment when the geometry of the game made it available. There is a quality to excellence that looks, from the outside, like patience. It is not patience. It is the absolute confidence of a man who knows the outcome, and is therefore in no hurry. Webb came down the lane on the fourth possession of the run, ball in hand, 2 dribbles from the basket, and he was taller than everyone on the court by 4 inches minimum. His path to the basket was a straight line. Nobody was going to challenge Marcus Webb in the lane on a summer court in Chicago in 1990. Nobody with ordinary ambition anyway. Jordan had been watching this happen all night with other defenders. He had seen how Webb set his feet, how he gathered the ball at waist height before he lifted, how he preferred to go left when the right side was contested. A slight mechanical tell that nobody on that court had thought to notice because nobody on that court had been paying that particular quality of attention. Jordan had been paying it. He had been paying it the way a professor pays attention to a text before an exam, the way a chess player pays attention to pattern 7 moves before they matter. Webb went left. Jordan rotated. Not fast, not dramatic. He arrived. That was all. He was simply there, inside the space Webb had already committed to, and when Webb's gather completed and the ball rose, and the 240 pounds of Marcus Webb launched skyward with a lifetime of frustration and redirected ambition, Jordan was already in the air. What happened next is the part that people who were there have described with a quiet reverence that borders on discomfort, as if they witnessed something they didn't entirely have permission to see. Jordan did not simply block the shot. He caught it, clean, over the outstretched arm, above the plane of the rim, and in the same motion he was already coming down and initiating the fast break, the ball transferring from his right hand to his left as his feet found the asphalt and his body reorganized itself for the other direction. Webb stood at the baseline for a full 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a long time when nothing is happening around you. 2 seconds on a court full of moving bodies is a conspicuous stillness. That moment, that specific stillness, that is what the people who were there remembered, not the block. The stillness. Let's go back to the beginning of what made this night possible, because the dunk, or the rejection, or the moment, whatever you choose to call it, did not come from nowhere. It came from a decade of accumulated mathematics, a precise accounting of every slight, every dismissal, every closed door, every coach who doubted, every teammate who wondered, every opponent who made the mistake of confusing Michael Jordan's silence for absence of intent. Jordan had been cut from his varsity basketball team as a sophomore at Laney High School in Wilmington. That story is well documented. What is less discussed is how he processed the cut, not with anger, not with the visible fire that the motivational posters suggest, but with a cold and systematic plan. He made the junior varsity team. He became the best player on that team by a margin that embarrassed the comparison. And then he waited. He waited with the controlled patience of someone who understood, even at 15, that revenge administered too early is indistinguishable from desperation. He waited until he was ready. Then he returned. That pattern, slight, silence, preparation, devastation, ran through his entire career like a structural beam. When the 1984 NBA draft passed him over twice before Portland chose him 3rd overall, he did not explode. He prepared. When the Pistons beat him repeatedly in the late 80s, when Dennis Rodman fouled him into the floor and Isaiah Thomas passed in front of him, and the bad boys made a sport of physical cruelty toward number 23, Jordan did not quit or adjust his ambition downward. He got stronger. He lifted weights in ways that NBA players of his era considered excessive. He rebuilt his body into something the Pistons could not bully, because he understood that the Pistons had given him a specific gift. They had shown him exactly what he needed to become. Scar tissue, properly understood, is not damage. It is the body's record of what it survived. And so when Marcus Webb, who had not been told who he was laughing at, looked down at the man in the white cutoff shirt and performed his dismissal, that laugh, casual, brief, absolute, he was not simply laughing at the player standing in front of him. He was laughing at every coach who ever doubted, at Dean Smith, who held Jordan to a system when the system was too small for what Jordan was becoming, at the Pistons in every playoff spring, at the critics who said he couldn't win the big one, at Isaiah Thomas and his handshake that still hadn't come. Webb didn't know any of this. He just saw a man in a cutoff shirt and made a calculation that was going to cost him something he would spend years trying to reclaim. The game resumed after the block and fast break with a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of a crowd that has been shocked into quiet. The silence of a crowd that is watching something they want to preserve in memory and are afraid that making noise will somehow reduce it. The chain-link fence vibrated slightly in a breeze off the lake. Someone said something low that nobody around them acknowledged. Webb stood at half court for the inbound, and those closest to him could see the recalibration happening in real time. The tightening of the jaw, the reset of the shoulders, the specific physical vocabulary of a man who is deciding whether to acknowledge what just happened or to pretend it didn't. He pretended it didn't. That was the second mistake. Jordan had no interest in ending it quickly. He was never interested in ending things quickly. The efficiency people spoke about when they discussed his scoring, the economy of motion, the percentage-based excellence, was real, but it coexisted with something that was almost its opposite, a willingness, on specific nights with specific opponents, to extend the process, to let a man fully understand the depth of his situation before the final accounting. Not cruelty, methodology. Jordan played those men the way a musician plays a difficult passage, not rushing to the resolution, letting the tension build until the release became inevitable and complete. What followed over the next 20 minutes of that run was not a single spectacular play. It was a systematic education. Jordan scored the next 6 consecutive baskets for his team. He scored them in different ways: a pull-up from the elbow, a drive that went right when everyone expected left, a catch-and-turn jumper from the mid-post that had the geometry of a completed equation. Each basket was, on its own, somewhat ordinary. Together they formed a sentence addressed specifically to one 7-foot man who was watching his own mythology being revised in real time. Webb tried twice to reassert himself. The first time he posted Jordan on the block, turned baseline, and got his shot contested by a hand that arrived from an angle that didn't seem physically possible. The shot went in, but it was altered, off the backboard instead of clean, and it went in a way that felt like a concession rather than a success. The second time, Webb caught the ball at the elbow, head-faked Jordan off his feet, and had a clear path to the basket. He gathered. He lifted. Jordan, who had left his feet on the fake, was already back on the ground and had somehow traveled the necessary distance. He didn't block this one. He stood in the space and forced the miss. The ball went long. The crowd made a sound. After that second miss, Webb walked to half court slowly. He put his hands on his knees. It was a brief gesture, 2 or 3 seconds. The kind a man makes when he needs oxygen and also when he needs a moment that no one else can enter. One of his teammates said something to him. Webb straightened. His face had the quality of a man listening to music he can't quite identify, something familiar in an unfamiliar arrangement. Here is the thing about being humiliated by someone operating at a different level. It is not the single spectacular moment that destroys you. It is the accumulation of small, precise corrections. It is the growing certainty that your best is being handled, managed, filed away. Webb was not being defeated by greater athleticism, though Jordan's athleticism that night was as close to inhuman as any of the witnesses could articulate. He was being defeated by a mind that had already simulated every possible version of this game before it started and had arrived on that court with a complete map of the territory. That is a different kind of losing. That kind leaves a mark that a single great performance the following week cannot erase. The run ended the way runs end on those courts. The losing team walks off. The next team waiting on the sideline comes on, and the business continues without acknowledgement of what just passed. Webb's team lost by 12. On a court where games go to 15, losing by 12 means you never led. You were never close. You existed for that stretch of summer night, entirely within someone else's jurisdiction. Webb left the court without looking at Jordan. That, too, was noticed by the witnesses. The decision to not look is its own statement. It says, "I acknowledge that looking would require me to see something I am not prepared to process with grace." It says, "The laugh I issued 40 minutes ago has become the most expensive thing I have ever said." Webb walked through the gap in the chain-link fence, past the bodies pressed against the perimeter, past the faces that had watched everything, and he kept walking until the orange sodium light was behind him and the darkness of the August street was around him, and he didn't say a word. Jordan sat back down on the concrete barrier. He unlaced his right shoe. He relaced it. Double knot. He drank from the water bottle. Someone on the next team said his name, and he looked up and nodded once. And then he waited to go back on. He was already thinking about the Pistons. There is a version of this story that ends here, at the chain-link fence, with Marcus Webb disappearing into an August night carrying something he didn't arrive with. That version is satisfying. It is also incomplete, because what happened to Marcus Webb in the weeks and months and years that followed that Tuesday night is the actual subject of the story, and it is more instructive than the moment itself. Webb came back to those courts. He came back the following week, and the week after that. He came back with a different quality of focus, a different economy of movement, as if the experience had stripped away the excess from his game and left only the essential. Players who ran with him in September of 1990 noted the change. He was harder to score on. He moved to his spots more deliberately. He stopped the performative displays, the hang-time exhibitions, the pre-game declarations, the casual intimidation that had been his signature. He played instead with a particular seriousness that had not been there before. It was the seriousness of a man who had been shown the actual ceiling of his environment and had decided to rebuild from the floor up. He never played professional basketball. His knee wouldn't survive the conditioning demands of a real training camp. And by 1990, that window, if it had ever genuinely existed, was permanently closed. But players who ran with Webb on the South Side courts through the early 90s will tell you that he became, in the years after that August night, the best outdoor basketball player most of them ever saw. Not despite what happened with Jordan. Because of it. The loss became the fulcrum on which he levered everything that followed. Michael Jordan, for his part, won his first NBA championship in June of 1991 when the Bulls defeated the Los Angeles Lakers 4-1, and he stood at center court of the Forum in Los Angeles with the trophy and the tears and the specific relief of a man who has been waiting long enough that the arrival is almost disorienting. He averaged 31 points per game in that postseason. He won his first Finals MVP. He beat the Pistons in the conference finals on the way there. A 4-0 sweep that was as close to a philosophical statement as basketball allows. The Pistons walked off the court without shaking hands, and Jordan watched them go, and if there was satisfaction on his face, it was the quiet, controlled kind, not the eruption, but the resolution. But before all of that, before the rings and the commercials and the statue outside the United Center and the documentary and the shoes that still sell 30 years later, there was a Tuesday night in August on the Dearborn Street courts, and there was a man who laughed, and there was a player who kept a list, and the list was about to be settled. The philosophical dimension of what Jordan represented, and this is the part that the game itself can only gesture toward, that requires the narrator's reflection to complete, was not athletic greatness. Athletic greatness was the vehicle. What Jordan represented was the transformation of pain into fuel, the absolute refusal to allow any humiliation to remain merely a humiliation, the insistence that every wound become a resource. He did not simply survive the failures of his early life and his early career. He harvested them. He took the cut from the varsity roster and made it the engine of his work ethic. He took the playoff losses to Detroit and made them the blueprint for his body's reconstruction. He took every laugh, every dismissal, every moment of underestimation, and he filed them. He filed them in a mental archive that was always accessible, always available to be opened and converted, the way a furnace opens to receive coal and returns heat. The cost of this, the actual human cost, was not small. Men who played with Jordan have described the experience with a mixture of awe and survivor's wariness that is the honest account of proximity to obsession. The same mechanism that made him the greatest player in the history of his sport made him, in the daily texture of relationships, a difficult and unsparing presence. He held standards that were his own standards, applied universally, without accommodation for the fact that other people had not organized their entire interior lives around competitive excellence. He expected from others what he had built in himself, and when they could not provide it, the response was not compassion, but pressure. Always more pressure. Some things become what they are because of what they refuse to release. Jordan had, by the time he arrived at those courts in August of 1990, been playing basketball seriously for 15 years. 15 years of deliberate, systematic, exhausting improvement. 15 years of choosing the harder practice when the easier one was available. 15 years of arriving before the other players and leaving after, of visualizing scenarios that hadn't happened yet so that when they did happen the body already knew the answer, of making the game so familiar in the mind that the physical execution was simply the most recent performance of something already perfectly rehearsed. Webb saw a man in a cutoff shirt on a summer court. What was actually standing there was the accumulated product of 15 years of uncommon choice. That is the contradiction implicit in the laugh. Webb wasn't wrong that the man in front of him was, in the context of that court, on that night, apparently unimpressive. What he couldn't see was that the apparent was a category error. What he couldn't see was that apparent and actual had diverged dramatically in the case of Michael Jordan, and that the divergence was not accidental but engineered, was not temporary but permanent, was not the result of talent alone but of the specific application of talent to a methodology that most people encounter in description and very few people encounter in practice. The block was 3 seconds. The preparation for the block was 15 years. Nobody in the crowd at those Dearborn Street courts that night would have described what they saw as a lesson. They would have said they saw a man get embarrassed. They would have said they saw Michael Jordan do Michael Jordan things, which by 1990 had become its own category of expected surprise. You knew something extraordinary was coming. You just couldn't know precisely when or what shape it would take. But underneath the athleticism, underneath the performance, was the architecture of an idea that Jordan had been constructing his entire life. That the only permanent advantage in competition is the willingness to prepare beyond the point where preparation remains comfortable. Every other advantage, size, speed, strength, natural talent, has a ceiling. The willingness to keep working past discomfort has no ceiling that anyone has yet discovered. And this is what remains when the night is over and the sodium lights have been switched off, and the asphalt has finally cooled, and the witnesses have gone home, and the chain-link fence stands empty against the Chicago sky. The work is always longer than the moment. The work is always less visible than the result. The preparation is always disproportionate to what it looks like from outside. Always more extreme, always more private, always more costly than anyone standing at the perimeter of your life can see or understand. Webb's mistake was not athletic. Webb's mistake was epistemological. He looked at Michael Jordan and believed he was seeing all of Michael Jordan, when what he was seeing was only the surface of a depth he had no instrument to measure. The lesson is portable. It travels. It applies to every arena where the preparation is invisible and the performance is public, where the years of private work produce a single public moment that looks, to the uninformed observer, like luck or talent or gift. It applies to every room you have ever entered and assessed at a glance and believed you understood. The man who laughed at Michael Jordan on a summer court in Chicago was wrong not about what he saw, but about the sufficiency of seeing. You never see all of a person. You see the surface of their current moment. Beneath that surface is everything they have survived, everything they converted, every morning they chose the harder thing, when the easier thing was also available. Before you laugh, before you dismiss, before you make the calculation that the person in front of you is not a threat worth respecting, understand that you are almost certainly looking at the most visible fraction of a story, whose full length and full weight you have not earned the right to estimate. Marcus Webb walked into the dark and carried something new with him. Michael Jordan laced his shoe and waited for the next run. The difference between them in that moment was not 7 inches or 60 pounds or a professional contract or a television commercial. The difference was a list. And a man who keeps a list and who has learned to convert what is on that list into fuel rather than wound is a man who has solved something that most people never solve at all. The work is the answer. It was always the answer. And the work begins before anyone is watching.